And um, my name's Kristine Rivers. I am a Texas Master Naturalist in the Cradle of Texas chapter, and I became an intern in the spring of 2016. And some of you may know me as a birder. I'm a bird nerd, and I do own a company called Birding for Fun. And I do a lot of nature education about a lot of things in addition to birds. So if you're surprised that I'm talking about apple snails, you're going to learn why tonight. So my journey with or discovery of apple snails actually happened back in February of 2013. And as always, whenever I'm out birding, I'm always looking at everything else in the habitat as well. And so my mother and I were birding along Mustang Bayou in Croy Memorial Park, which is off of County Road 48 here in Manville. And we noticed all of these very large freshwater snail shells along the shoreline of the bayou. And so we collected them up, and I took this picture of them, and we washed them off. You can see they were quite pretty and as big as the palm of our hand, so quite large. And that's as far as I went with it back in 2013. But fast forward to 2016, when I became a certified master naturalist in May. And then a few months later was out birding again in that same exact park in Manville with my husband, and we noticed these giant snails again. And so now, with my newfound ability to dig into things a little deeper as a master naturalist, I discovered that they were giant apple snails. And the scientific name for that is Pomacea maculata. And there's a little bit of a story behind that taxonomic identification that we're going to look at. But I looked them up and I found information about them on the U.S. Geological Survey, the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database, or the NAS database. And I've given you the link to it here, and we will include it in the email that John sends out as well. But it is an amazing resource for people. It's available to anybody. So biologists, different groups, and then people like us that are in the general public. And it tracks aquatic invasive species, and they define an invasive species as an organism that causes harm to the ecology, economy, or quality of life in an environment where it isn't native or where it is non-indigenous. And this site tracks movement of populations. It allows you to do real-time queries where you can see where the most recent reports have been, and it gives you a lot of great distribution maps. So all of the information that you're going to see in my presentation tonight, I gathered from that website. So now giant apple snails are considered to be the genus and species of Pomacea maculata, and they are mollusks and then further categorized as gastropods or snails. And they are, as I mentioned, non-indigenous. So the first apple snails were documented in the U.S. in Florida in 1989. And at that time, they were originally identified as the channeled apple snail, or Pomacea canaliculata. And further advances in genetic studies, also known as DNA, identified that the species found along the Gulf Coast were actually island apple snails, or Pomacea insularum. And that happened in 2007. And those two species are morphologically or observably almost identical. But DNA testing led us to discover that they actually were the same as a species that was first described by Georges Perry in March of 1810, or which was the giant apple snail, or it's sometimes also known as the spotted apple snail, which is Pomacea maculata. So the ones that we have here in Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana are different than the ones that are found in California and Arizona. The giant apple snail is the largest snail on Earth, and it has a spherical or globular shaped shell that has a small spire. So here you can see that the spire is very flattened, and then the opening of the shell is actually 75% of its overall size, and they can measure up to 6 inches in from the spire all the way to the bottom of the shell. They are highly variable in color, but they're usually golden to tan, and they often have these brown or black bands that you see going across them here. And they have an operculum or gill cover that closes that aperture. They are native to the tropics and subtropics of South America, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And because they are a tropical and subtropical species, they can't survive below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They prefer slow-moving fresh water in bayous, streams, ponds, lakes, and dishes, but they can tolerate salinity up to 8 parts per thousand. All apple snails are amphibious, so they have a dual respiratory system with gills for life underwater and a lung for aerial breathing. That adaptation makes them very well adapted to life in an environment in which water sources dry up intermittently. And that describes our area pretty well, right? Right now we're going through a drought, and a lot of our freshwater areas have dried up or are very low in oxygen levels. But their dual respiratory system allows them to overcome low oxygen levels in the water, and it also allows them to forage on land for short periods. And here in Texas, there are 9 sub-watersheds with records. And when I first found them or identified them and discovered them there in Mustang Bayou in 2016, I discovered a reporting tool on that NAS database site, and I reported them, and I never heard anything back. And later, when I dug a little deeper, I figured out why. The earliest documentations here in Texas were in the West Galveston Bay watershed in the year 2000. And here in blue is the area that I discovered them. So I was a little bit late in my reporting. They had known about them for 16 years at that time. But you can see that in 2000, they were well established in the American Canal and in Mustang Bayou. When I first did this presentation back in 2016 for my chapter, this was the distribution in the United States, and each of these points shows an established location. So just a documentation, it doesn't show density. And you can see at that time they were very well established in Florida, and then were progressing across towards the Houston area. And then there were a couple of outlier documentations near Dallas and over towards Arizona as well. But when I was updating this presentation yesterday, I discovered that they have already spread quite a bit in the 7 years since I first did this presentation. And if you look, you can see that they have spread a little bit further north in some states like Alabama and Louisiana, and they have spread northward and southward here in Texas, as well as westward. And then they have become more established over towards Arizona. And so if you look at that, you can really see that they have spread quite a bit in that 7 years' time. This actually shows density because knowing where they are is not necessarily as helpful as understanding how badly that area is impacted. So here you can see that the smallest areas here where only one report has been made, sorry about that, are indicated by these small yellow circles. And then as the circles get larger and as the color changes darker and darker, you can see the higher density. And in our area here in the Houston area, you can see that we have some serious population density. And the Arizona area also has a very large population density as well. And of course, Florida, where they were first documented, they have really grown quite dense in population there as well. So this is a map that came from the Ecological Risk Screening Summary of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, published back in 2018, but the map is actually as old as 2014. And at that time, they were looking at climate matches that had that, the type of climate that would be conducive to supporting this snail population. And I tried to enlarge it for you here, but the blue areas indicate where they are not very likely at all to have very good success. And then as you get more and more into the warmer tones and into the red, that is where they have the best climate match for success. And you can see that this lines up pretty well with what we're seeing in that spread in the maps that were just on the previous slides. So how did it get here? Unfortunately, all of the spread has been due to human influence. Originally, these apple snails were sold as mystery snails in the aquarium trade. They are quite colorful and very large, and so people thought they made great aquarium pets. But unfortunately, they have a voracious appetite, so they were often released out into freshwater areas. They also came from aquarium plant contamination because they lay their eggs on vegetation. As aquarium plants were moved from tank to tank in the aquarium trade, that spread them again. And in Asian countries, they are often in aquaculture as a live food source. We're going to talk about why that isn't a good solution for them, though. And they often escaped from aquaculture. They can also be accidentally dispersed in rice paddy soil and have been documented from accidental movement on crawfish and agricultural products. And then people in their infinite wisdom also decided that they might make a great biological control for weeds. And so they introduced them into freshwater habitats to try to control vegetation. Giant apple snail reproduction is, well, it's prolific. The sexes are separate, so there is a distinct male and female, and the fertilization is internal. And I went to a presentation at the state meeting several years ago about apple snails that was put on by Texas Parks and Wildlife. And always curious, I said, how can you tell the sexes apart, thinking, perhaps that I could go out and, maybe figure it out myself. And they said that you could tell the difference in the sexes by peeling back the operculum and seeing the reproductive organs inside. And I immediately said, will that does that hurt the snails? And so that got kind of an uncomfortable, awkward silence in the room, followed by a little bit of a giggle when they told us, well, we're trying to eliminate them by killing them. And so I don't know that that's necessarily, of concern, but we don't think it hurts the snails. And so I felt a little silly, but that's the kind of master naturalist I am, you guys. I didn't want to hurt them if I was trying to figure out whether they were male or female. But breeding is seasonal. It's influenced by air and water temperature and by rainfall amounts. And estivation occurs during warm, dry seasons like we are experiencing right now. They mature pretty rapidly. Sexual maturity is at about 9 months of age. They only live to about 2 years in the wild, but one female can lay up to 1.2 million eggs during her lifetime. So in that 15-month span where she is sexually mature, she can lay over 1 million eggs. Eggs are laid overnight just above the waterline on emergent vegetation and hard surfaces in clutches of up to 2,000 eggs, and they lay clutches every 5 to 14 days. The egg masses look a lot like cotton candy. They are large masses that are bright pink, and the hatch rate is only about 10%. So that's a little bit of good news. But the eggs hatch in about 2 weeks. And after that, the juveniles enter the water and mature further in the water. So this is a picture that I took there at Croy Memorial Park in October of 2016. And here you can see those egg masses on the vegetation and also on the hardscape there in the park. So here on the pier, you can see that they are just as comfortable crawling up and laying them above the water line on hard surfaces as well. Because this species grazes on emergent and submerged aquatic plants and terrestrial plants near the water, and that voracious appetite that they have, and the dual respiratory system that allows it to leave the water to forage, they can cause economic harm by feeding on rice crops. And we have a lot of rice crops here in Texas and right here in Brazoria County where I'm at. But so far, there hasn't been too much impact to rice crops in Texas. They can also cause economic harm by interfering with the crawfish industry, by competing for food, clogging trap openings, and then impeding the harvest. Populations can attain very high density, causing competition with our native snails, which is a problem. And unfortunately, at low density, they grow faster and reproduce more. And here in Texas, where we can have very, very hot seasons in the summer, they can actually mature faster at 4 months and start laying eggs and then explode in population density. One of the reasons why they're not good for food source or in the food trade is because they are an intermediary host of the rat lungworm parasite, and that can cause disease in humans that consume infected snails. The larvae move into the human brain to mature and cause neurological damage, so they aren't good for the food trade. So what can we do about them? Agricultural controls include crop rotation, tilling, regulation of water levels, water inlet grills, and hand removal. And if you are a master naturalist in the Galveston County group or in the Brazoria County chapter, you may have participated in some of that removal. You cannot, it is illegal to do that as a normal citizen. You have to have special permits for that. And so any of the removals that we participate in are done in coordination with Texas Parks and Wildlife and with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And those are gathered up. People will go out in kayaks. They will scoop them out in nets and put them into ice chests. And then all of those snails that are gathered in that way are frozen for humane euthanization. Chemical controls using molluscicides has been found to be somewhat effective, but snails can avoid exposure by going underwater, and egg masses cause constant reinfestation because the chemical control doesn't affect the eggs. Biological controls might be possible, but in native areas, so in South America, they have found that predators don't significantly control snail populations, and there are few known predators in the United States. The only documented terrestrial predator that has been observed capturing and eating adult giant apple snails is the raccoon. And obviously, we don't have a way of setting them loose on the population. Ducks and fish consume eggs, but ducks can also cause additional damage to rice crops, so that is not a very welcome measure. And the best kind of fish that have been found to be most effective have been black carp, but those are also invasive, and we don't want to try to control one invasion with another invasion. Recently, in 2018, there has been research that has suggested that development of all-male prawn populations has potential as a biocontrol agent over both hatchling and adult apple snails. The smaller prawns were able to eat the hatchlings, and then larger ones were able to eat apple snails up to 15 millimeters in length. Nature is pretty amazing, though, and in Florida, where you saw that there are huge populations, snail kites, which had bills that were adapted for native snails, which are quite a bit smaller, over time, their bills have been increasing in size, and that has allowed them to begin to feed on these larger apple snails. Nutritional quality, though, is lower than native snails, and so ornithologists have been studying that, and there have been some negative health impacts associated when they are checking the nutritional quality for juvenile kites. And that may be mitigated by the fact that the snails are so much larger. Maybe the larger amount of meat offsets that, but right now we're not really sure. In Florida, there are a lot of limpkins, and limpkins are very large wading birds that have very long bills that are twisted at the tip. And that is an adaptation for removing snails from their shells. And up until 2021, we didn't have limpkins in Texas. They first appeared in Texas in April 2021 on a private property that was near Brazos Bend State Park. And all of us birders rushed there to hike a very long way into that property to get a very distant view of those limpkins. But they soon moved over into the state park, and a lot of people started going there to find them. And now, fast forward a couple of years, they are nesting in Brazos Bend State Park. They've also been documented in Sheldon Lake State Park and in Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge. And this next video that I'm going to show you, my husband and I shot back in just about a month ago in Anahuac, and they are still considered rare enough that we had to provide photographic documentation of the species. Hopefully you can see that okay. You can see they are a very large wading bird, look a little bit like an ibis, perhaps with that down-curved bill. They have a lot of streaking and spotting, but as we move in closer here, look at the twist at the end of the bill that allows them to break into those shells and extract the meat from the shell. This actually was right near the beginning of Shoveler Pond Loop in Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge, if you're familiar with that. Here you can see that really unique shape to the bill and that twist at the end that allows it to be able to extract the meat from the shell of the snail. So what can we do? Eradication is really impossible, so our goal is management to reduce populations and impacts. And as I mentioned, it's possible to remove the adults physically by hand or with traps, but it is currently illegal to possess snails unless they have been shucked, because they are covered under a regulation that actually was aimed at mollusks such as the zebra mollusk. And so we don't really remove them from the shells. So as I mentioned, they scoop them up with nets with a permit and then freeze them. However, it is legal to destroy the egg masses, and you can do that by smashing them with kayak paddles and submerging them when they're on vegetation. But that doesn't really work if the eggs are nearly ready to hatch, and you can tell that by when they become lighter pink. So it's now suggested that you remove the vegetation, put them inside trash bags before you smash them to avoid contamination, and then throw those away in trash cans. You can make sighting reports for documentation purposes only at this link, which we will also send out to you. So if you see them somewhere and you go onto the site and they haven't been reported there yet, or if you just want to put more current documentation in, you can make a report and it will add them to that database. And there is also signage that's available for places and access points near infected areas that will inform the public about the problem and how to identify the snails from those hot pink egg masses. And then they will also describe lawful control methods, which is crushing those egg masses. All right, that is the end of my presentation. I used to have a few of those signs available. I think I might have one more, but if you are interested in getting any of those signs, let John know and he will let me know, and we can find some more for you from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and those can be put up in parks or areas near you. All right, that is the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, Kristine, we have one question in chat. The question is, how did Uri affect the giant apple snail population?
Oh, you know, I'm not sure how Uri affected it, but I know how Harvey impacted it. And what you saw there on in the 2016 was pre-Harvey, which was in 2017, and the flooding did actually cause the spread of those snails. So definitely we know that the natural weather conditions, if it causes flooding, can push those through. So I would think that if Uri caused some freshwater flooding further inland, then it definitely could have helped to spread it.
All right, thank you. Are there any more questions for Kristine? If so, if you'll just type those into the chat, I'll read them out to her, and also Kristine can monitor that herself, but probably easier for me to do it for her.
I've got the chat open now, so
Okay.
I'll be happy to field those questions while you're doing your presentation.
I can do that.
Oh, Kathy is saying that Uri was the ice storm. That's right. So that was February of 2021. And since they can't survive below 50 degrees, then I would think it probably impacted the population somewhat, but they can hang out underwater because they have those gills. So they're able to breathe underwater. And it was definitely over that there. So they can ride out the ice storm. See, Tiffany is asking, what is the furthest north they've been seen? And I am not sure. It looked like probably Arizona and maybe Dallas are about the same laterally.
Yeah, on that map you showed it, it looked like there was one observation up in near the Great Lakes.
Oh, wow. So that probably would be from an aquarium dump. Yeah. All right. I think that's the last question.
All right. Let me get my presentation fired up. Okay. So we got to kind of put the cart before the horse, but I wanted Kristine to kick us off this evening in case she had other things to do this evening, just to, be respectful of her time as well. All right, so welcome everyone. This is the Last Water Wednesdays for 2023. The title of this, as you should know, is Aquatic Invasive Species. We have a lot of invasive species, just not aquatic. We have quite a few aquatic, but we have even more terrestrial and invasive species as well. And I didn't cover all the invasive species we have here in Texas. Some of them don't even exist, but they are on a watch list, so to speak. So just be aware that there could be more of those. All right, so Kristine already covered this. What's an invasive species? I won't read it to you, but just be aware that there's a formal definition. It came from an executive order in February 3rd, 1999. And also the website that Kristine used with the U.S. Geological Survey. I'll be referencing that website as well. And then also there's Texas Invasives, which is another good website to take a look at and be familiar with, because it's easier to search for me, but it has a little less information. And then there's an invasives.org, and we will send out those links to you in the future. All right, so here's an oldie but a goodie. This is a hydrilla, and what's interesting is that they actually gave it a common name of water time, and I've always known it as just a hydrilla. But this is one of those invasive species that has been in Texas for a while, and it's an aquatic freshwater plant, but it can tolerate brackish waters. And even water that's really turbid. And when I say turbid, I mean it's cloudy due from either clay suspension, or it can be biological. It is a submerged aquatic weed. It's rooted to the bottom. The stems can grow very long and spindly, where they can form these thickened mats up at the surface. And the stems can be as long as 30 feet long. And so what happens with this particular plant is that it creates a thick mat of vegetation at the surface, and it's difficult for boats to pass. It's also difficult for fishermen, anglers, and then just use of that water body. So if you encounter hydrilla, I work a lot with pond owners here in Brazoria County, and I always get asked questions about, I think I have hydrilla in my pond, and I tell them, it's not likely unless you introduced it yourself, but that's always a possibility that you could get it through all the multiple floods we've had. So what do we know about it? How do we ID it? Well, it does produce a small white flower, and that flower is held above the surface of the water. Hydrilla also has simple leaves, and they are in sets of 4 to 8 arranged in a whorl around the stem. And then the margin of the leaf is serrated. So if you look closely at that picture, you can see the serration along the edge of the leaf. That would be one of the defining characteristics of the plant. But the truly diagnostic feature of hydrilla is the presence of 1 to 4 bumps or hooks that are located on the underside of the leaf along the midrib. So if we look at this picture here, let me get my laser pointer out. This it's not a great photograph, it's kind of small, but you can see the bumps here, or they look like hooks, and you'll find 1 to 4 of those along this midrib on the underside of the leaf. This is a turon, which is a sort of like a seed that allows the plant to overwinter, and I think it's the overwintering adaptations that have made hydrilla a very successful invader. So when we look at what are some of the threats, well, it does form these monocultures or monospecific stands of this particular plant, and it outcompetes and replaces native vegetation by shading out those other plants that just don't grow as aggressively as hydrilla does. It also can lower dissolved oxygen levels by the sheer biomass. So the way that works, we all know plants photosynthesize and produce oxygen after taking in carbon dioxide. But at night, the dark cycle takes over, and then it reverses, and the plants actually begin to draw oxygen out of the water to sustain themselves until the sun rises and they can start photosynthesizing again. That with the sheer biomass that is produced in a hydrilla infestation, that can drop the dissolved oxygen levels in a body of water below the lethal limits of that can support fish. So you can't have those fish kills associated with hydrilla infestations. Also, the tubers in this picture, those are tubers. And then we saw the turons, which is the other reproductive part of the plant. And what's interesting is that they allow them to overwinter, and the turons can remain dormant and in the sediment for up to 4 years. So you may kill out the parent stand, but when it comes back the next year, you'll have to treat again to get rid of it again because of those turons that are allowing it to stay. Pictures of an infestation. This was taken in Florida. Now I know that we have a hydrilla in, it's in the Lower Colorado River Authority Lake in Texas. It's up by Bastrop. I know we have them there, and we have them in other parts of the lake. I just showed distribution. I didn't do the point sourcing of those, but if you'll visit that website, you can go and see those maps. They'll have them on the website, and you can see where it is located. So our distribution for the United States, and this is from August 3rd, 2023, we can see that hydrilla is fairly widespread. We do certainly have it in Texas. I'm not sure why it doesn't show up in New Mexico, but we have it in Arizona, California, Oregon, and then of course the southern Gulf states, and then all the way along the Atlantic seaboard and even parts of the central United States. So it's fairly widespread in the United States. What are some of our management options? Well, the best control is prevention, right? So there's a whole campaign to educate boaters about inspecting their boat if they've been in a lake where there's hydrilla, and then remove it before they transport their boat to another lake. And that might include, washing their trailers down, checking their live wells, washing their live wells out, letting the boat dry, air dry overnight or for a few days. And, that's a common theme on preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species. And because it's so easy to have strands of hydrilla hanging on the wheel axle of your boat, and you trailer it from one lake to another lake 15 miles down the road, and then you've just infested that lake as well with it. There are mechanical removers, harvesters and choppers. However, hydrilla does reproduce quite readily through fragmentation. So when you break it into small parts, it just produces a lot more hydrilla, which will eventually, root and then continue to grow like I described earlier. Because hydrilla is from Asia, the grass carp is a natural predator of it. Grass carps are herbivores, and back when Lake Conroe was infested with hydrilla, Texas A&M was asked to oversee a study, a project, and so they stocked all these grass carp in Lake Conroe. And they did a phenomenal job. They wiped out all the hydrilla, but then the bass fishermen got up in arms because there's no vegetation, and so they raised Cain, kind of blackened the eye of Texas A&M, at least the Department of Wildlife and Fishery Sciences. That's a story that's still told. In fact, when I was working on my undergraduate degree, A&M people would wear shirts that said, "I survived the Lake Conroe rote noning." Rote none's a pice toxin that's specific to fish. And so they had to go in and rote none the lake to get rid of the grass carp. So sometimes using one invasive species, as Kristine said, to control another is not necessarily the best idea, and it's always the unintended consequences that get you. But grass carp now are sterile. There's only one place in the United States you can get them, and every fish is certified. So you can bring them into Texas, but they are triploid and they're certified to be sterile and non-reproductive. And then there's a whole slew of herbicides that can be used. I've listed the active ingredients of these herbicides. They're rated excellent, good. Excellent, you're going to get 90 to 100% control. You'll never eradicate it completely because of the turons and the tubers, but you can control it, and that's the best we can hope for. And then physically, you can drain the infested water body, which of course it would be depending on whether you had water well access, the size of it, a lot of different things would go into play. You can let it dry out and then kill the hydrilla and then refill it. But here again, that could be a costly proposition and not really practical, depending on the size of the water body. And then finally, you can control nutrients. So if you have a a lot of nutrient inputs from the surrounding watershed or the watershed that's spurring the growth of it. If you can control the nutrients, then you can at least slow the infestation down. So if you just have to have some alternatives to hydrilla in, say, your farm pond or your ornamental pond, because I mean it's sold in the aquarium trade too, then here are some options for you. These are all native plants that you could substitute. And interesting, I had a gentleman call me because I do a lot of pond management here in Missouri County, and he asked me, he said, I can't get anything to grow in my pond. I'm thinking I'm going to go find some hydrilla and bring it in. I said, oh, you don't want to do that. One, it's illegal. Transportation of these invasive, what are listed on the Texas invasive species list, can land you with a pretty hefty fine. So you don't want to be moving aquatic invasives around the state knowingly. I mean, people do it accidentally, but that's why there's a whole campaign to educate the public about preventing the spread of those. All right, another one we have is common water hyacinth. We also have a rooted hyacinth. What's interesting about water hyacinth, and you can find it here in Missouri County quite readily. It's in Buffalo Bayou. It's in Oyster Creek, coming back in Oyster Creek. Just about any slow water slough, you'll find water hyacinth growing. It was brought in 1884, so it's been here for a while. It was actually brought in to New Orleans at the Cotton States Exposition, and it was being displayed as a plant that would be beneficial for ornamental water gardens. It does have a very showy flower, and that's one of the attractions to it. But it can get out of hand rather quickly. So how do we identify it? Well, it's a free-floating plant. It has very bright green oval or elliptical leaves, and those leaves can be up to 6 inches long. 6 inches wide. They have a waxy cuticle on it, and then the petally, this area here, which is basically the stem, is spongy. And then often it'll have a bulge at the base of the stem. So they do produce that pretty bluish purple flower late in the summer, early fall. It's one of the attractions. And each plant can produce a spike, and that spike can have 18 to 15 flowers on it. It does produce a fruit that can contain up to 450 seeds. And then these seeds can remain viable for up to 30 years. So once you kill the parent plants, then you have to worry about the seed bed of these seeds that can come back again and again. However, while the seeds are a form of reproduction, the stolon, and in this picture here, this is a stolon, so it's just basically growing a clone of the mother plant, if you will. And then it'll just grow another stolon out and another stolon. And that's the primary form of reproduction. This is a look at what a pretty heavy infestation might look like. Here again, they're all floating plants. But they do invade the water hyacinth will invade lakes, ponds, rivers, marshes, and just about any other type of wetland habitat you can think about. It will quickly form dense floating mats, and it can double in size within 2 weeks. So, it's a rapid reproducer. And then what happens is that depending on the size of the water body and the severity of the infestation, these dense mats can then restrict sunlight down to the underwater environment, and that in turn reduces sunlight to the other submerged plants, which then in turn they die, and then they decompose by bacteria, and then that can deplete. Well, one, it can affect the food chain because the invertebrates that are feeding on those submerged plants no longer have a food source, and the fish that are feeding on those invertebrates, they're deprived of food because they've died. And then ultimately, you can have a depletion of dissolved oxygen in that water body, and that entire pond or lake suffocates. In the bayous of Louisiana and East Texas, it can choke those bayous. I mean, even in Oyster Creek, there is a severe infestation of water lettuce, which I did not focus on in this presentation, but water lettuce and water hyacinth, and that Oyster Creek was non-navigable. You could not paddle a kayak or a canoe or move a boat through it because of the fact that it was clogged so heavily with this invasive species. So here's our distribution. Here again, brought over into New Orleans back in the 1884, and it has pretty much covered the state of Louisiana. I'm not sure why that one parish doesn't have any, but maybe they've just done a really good job at controlling it. But you can see that it has since moved over into Texas. And what's interesting, and I believe hopefully it was legal. When I was a student at A&M, I worked at a water lily farm, and we shipped water lilies all over Texas and the United States. But occasionally we would get orders for water hyacinth, and we could, I believe, legally ship them up to the northern states because it doesn't do well in the cold. It is a tropical plant since it's from Brazil. But for the state of Texas, it's considered to be a nuisance and a noxious aquatic species, and therefore you're not supposed to have it or even move it around the state. But some states do allow it because it does die back in the winter completely, and then it needs to be restocked in the springtime. So that's primarily just for water gardens, but still not probably wise to do that. So here again, prevention is the best way. Check everything. Don't move it. Don't go pull them out of the bayou and put them in your water garden. If you're here in the state of Texas, don't put them in your pond. That's going to create problems for you. In the bayous of Louisiana and southeast Texas, they do use these plant harvesters and choppers. It's basically a big barge with a conveyor belt on it, and they'll just run that down through the clogged waterway and either chop that water hyacinth up into small parts or bring it up the conveyor belt and dump it into a hopper. The problem with that is that because aquatic plants are about 98% water, there's frequent trips to the shore to unload it, and then they let the sun desiccate the living plant and kill it that way. But it's frequent trips because of the weight. Let's see, there are chemicals that can be used on it that are effective. And then here again, draining that infested water body or controlling the nutrient input is one way. Kind of an interesting story. A friend of mine and colleague was out on a NOAA research vessel out in the Gulf of Mexico, and we had some heavy flooding in Louisiana, and there's a big floating mat of water hyacinth out in the middle of the Gulf. And, you know, a lot of times you'll see that if you're near the mouth of a river or a stream where it gets pushed out into the salt water, can't live in the salt water. But he said that in the center of that floating mat of water hyacinth was a nutria. And anyway, I got something on nutria later in the presentation, but because water hyacinth can't survive in salt water, eventually that nutria was going to meet its demise along with the water hyacinth. Here are some native Texas alternatives if you want to source those out for, say, a water, ornamental water garden or something like that. If you do put water lilies, these native water lilies, in a small earthen pond, I recommend you plant those in a pot and not directly into the pond bottom, because they will spread. Pickerel weed is an emergent plant, so it grows around the border of the pond. And you may notice that it is in the same family as water hyacinth. All right, here's a bad one. Giant salvinia. Here again, they gave it the name of carbea weed. The scientific name is Salvinia molesta. It's a native of South America. It came in South Carolina. This is not the full distribution, but it's found from Virginia down to all the way over into Hawaii. And it's one of those plants that you can search for it online. In fact, I was surprised, and I should have included a picture of it, but it's in the aquarium trade, and you can buy it online still. Now, you can't bring it into Texas, and so it's probably prohibited from bringing it into Texas, and plus it's already here. But I was very surprised that it was being sold actively online, given the nature of how aggressive it is and the ecological damage that it can cause. So, as I said, it's a popular aquarium and water garden plant. It was first detected outside of aquarium and landscape cultivation in South Carolina, and that was in 1995. It made its way into Texas by 1997, and it's been rapidly spreading within the state of Texas as well as other southern states over the years. Now, it's just not confined to the continental United States. It's caused problems in Australia, New Zealand, pretty much any country that's warm enough to support it. So if you get way up into the far northern climates, it's not going to survive, or far south climates, it's not going to survive. But if you get around the equatorial zone and several latitudes above and below the equator, it's going to do just fine. So how do you identify it? Well, first of all, it's a floating fern. It's an aquatic fern, and it doesn't have any roots. So in this picture, you might be saying, well, wait a minute, John, those are roots. And actually, these are fronds, and you can see a picture of them there. So as it's growing, it's actually the fronds that are hanging down below the floating plant mass. If you want to ID it, so that's what it looks like. And we'll talk about these hairs right here. And I got a better picture of the plant where it's not upside down, where we can take a little closer look. But to ID it, the leaves are oblong and flat, or they're semi-cupped or folded when the plant's in a little more mature stage of growth. The plant grows in chains and it floats on the surface of the water, forming these dense mats. So here again, just like water hyacinth, that does form. It's a floating plant. It forms a mat. The leaves will grow in pairs, and they'll grow approximately 1.5 inches wide to 1 inch long. And let's see, the upper surface of the green leaves are covered with these rows of white coarse hairs. And what's interesting is that they act as a way to repel water. So when treating giant salvinia, those hairs actually repel, and that's one of the problems. It repels the herbicide, which is mixed with water. And so they have to use a really good surfactant to make that chemical stick to the leaf. It is a native South America, as I said, and they do reproduce through sporangia, but they're also thought to produce they were thought to produce just by fragmentation. They can double, or a giant salvinia can double in size in 4 to 10 days under good condition. So it's a rapid grower and rapid reproducer. So here's the leaf hairs I was referring to. There's a common salvinia, which you'll find listed on the Texas Invasive site. And in fact, I believe it was common salvinia I encountered at Lake Texana, which is over in Jackson County, not too far from here. It could have been giant salvinia. I reported it to the game wardens there, and they confirmed that it was a salvinia, but I didn't really examine the leaf hairs. But the difference is, on common salvinia, the leaf hairs are open, kind of look like a hydra or a sea anemone, whereas on giant salvinia, the leaf hairs form this cup, which looks like an egg beater. So that would be a diagnostic characteristic of giant salvinia if you were to encounter it. And then, of course, if you do, you can go to that U.S. Geological Survey website and report it. So here's another picture of it, just showing you how it forms these chains. It's kind of a pretty plant, but the problems it causes certainly are not worth importing it or spreading it throughout our state or other states for that matter. So it does form the leaves form a long chain. They run together, and then the consequence of that is that they form a very thick mat on the surface of the water. The mats can get so thick. In fact, there's pictures of a grown man standing on top of the mats, because the mats can grow to be three feet thick, and so they can support the weight of a man. And then once that happens, it will completely suffocate a body of water, because it reduces the light, so you don't have any primary productivity, because the phytoplankton can't get sunlight because they're under a mat or under the surface of this floating mat. You don't get submerged aquatic weeds, native submerged plants producing oxygen, because their sunlight's blocked, and it literally can suffocate an entire body of water. It is listed, Salvinia molesta is listed on the federal noxious weed list, and it can invade almost any type of aquatic system. So what are we going to do about it, if anything? Well, that's a pretty severe infestation. So you can see that entire surface is covered with it. In fact, if you go to Lake Texana, some of the little finger tributaries will be, that's how I noticed it. It wasn't long when we got the notification that we had salvinia in the state of Texas. that I had visited the park and noticed it, and so that I went and investigated a little bit closer. But that's what you'd see, and then of course if you have a large lake, which I have pictures of, you can see some. When we talk about mitigation, we'll see how it can also affect open water as well. So here's the current distribution. This map wasn't taken from the USGS site, but it is another website that you can access where it does have distribution. But you can see that it, way up here in Virginia, I'm not sure why it's up there. Because here again, it can't tolerate the real cold, but it's primarily down along the southern Gulf Coast, and then over in Arizona, probably in irrigation canals, I would think. And then, I'm sorry, yeah, Arizona right there, and then California, Southern California there. So it does, would impact irrigation canals and also natural bodies of water. So I guess the management issues, how to control it, prevention, obviously it's one of those plants. If you're in a lake where, we know it's present, you would definitely want to inspect your trailer. They do mechanical removal of it. They can apply aquatically approved herbicides, but there is a biological control, the Salvinia weevil, and it's grown. It's not available. It's grown in a lab because it grows on living Salvinia on this particular plant. So it is in experimental phases, and it is released to control infestations. Now, I do not know if they're releasing, if we have the Salvinia weevils here in the state of Texas, but I do know that we have Salvinia molesta in Caddo Lake, Toledo Bend, and other lakes. I think I have a map of that. So here's a before and after picture. This is in the University of Queensland. So this is a lake that was infested heavily by Salvinia in Australia. Now they've already introduced the weevil to it. So this is a population that's infected with the larvae of the weevil. And then here's the after picture. So you can see it really, you got a little bit in the foreground, a little bit of Salvinia here, but considering the before and after picture, the weevils are really doing a good job. Now, what other ecological threat might they be being introduced since they're non-native? I don't know, but they do certainly work well on controlling in this particular instance. So if you have a water garden or some other lake, here again, you can use the white water lily, which is native to Texas. You can use American lotus, although that in itself can become invasive, even though it's native. Or floating hearts, which is a plant that grows at the surface, and it produces little tubers. The mother plant produces little tubers that then sprout other plants. All right, we're going to switch gears from plants to mollusks. We're going to treat two different mollusks the same way because they both entered the same drainage, basically came from the same part of the world, and they have similar impact in their infestations. So we have the zebra mussel, Dracaena polymorpha. When I started my career in Louisiana, zebra mussel, we were on the zebra mussel watch because it was widespread. It was introduced in the Great Lakes in 1988 through ballast water. It rapidly spread in the Great Lakes, up in the Great Lakes. It then made its way down the Mississippi River drainage, Working in Louisiana, we had to attend workshops where we had to learn to identify it. So if a client brought a zebra mussel specimen in for us to ID, we'd be able to ID it and then be able to report the spread. It was first introduced in Lake St. Clair, and that's a lake that is on the border between Michigan and Ontario, Canada. And then from there, it has just spread. And it is here in Texas. Here's the other lake, a quagga mussel, and flipping back, you can see the difference. Well, I have a close-up of the zebra mussel. So the quagga mussel is just kind of plain. It has, it's beige with some of these stripes here. But when we look at a close-up of a zebra mussel, we can see the striking difference. It has these jagged striations on the outside of the shell. They're fairly small. It's a biofouler. They can just, just like a lot of mussels, they'll reproduce. They have free swimming veligers, which are the immature swimming form. But then the veligers will find hard substrate. They're light on it, glue themselves to it with these threads, and then other mussels will colonize that hard structure, and they literally just grow one on top of the other, forming these dense reefs or hard structures on hard substrate. Zebra mussels, the maximum shell length can be 3.5 to 4 centimeters. They're usually found in large clusters. And here again, they're non-native. They came over from the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea over in Russia and Ukraine. So here's the problem with them being a biofouler. This was just one picture that I had, but there are other pictures where they clog the internal workings of power plants, water treatment plants, nuclear plants. They biofoul. I didn't include the picture, but there's a grocery cart that's completely covered with them. You can see the lower unit of this motorboat that's completely covered with them, but you can see how it's almost like cardiovascular disease with plaque, where it just completely clogs the inside of this pipe. The plant has to shut down. They have to take the plumbing apart, clean out all the internal parts of the plant. So it's a very huge economic cost. Zebra mussels are costing millions of dollars annually due to the shutdowns and cleanup requirements. It did eventually make its way into Lake Pontchartrain. At this point, I'd moved back to Texas and taken a job here. I have not heard if the oil refineries on the Mississippi River are experiencing this sort of problems that the northern lakes were experiencing, but there was some glimmer of hope that freshwater drum might become a predator of this particular species and help keep it in check. All right, so here's a picture of the infestation for both the zebra and the quagga mussel. The red circles are the zebra mussels. The green circles are the quagga. The yellow circles are both species occurrences, and you can see that they have entered Texas after and probably from a boat trailer because they first entered Texas, if I'm not mistaken, from Lake Texoma. And so it's speculated that they came from Louisiana or Arkansas by a boat trailer and then into the lake. And from there, they've just begun to spread. So we have 30 Texas lakes that occur across 5 river basins that are classified as being infested here in the state of Texas, meaning that they have, when I say infested, I mean they have a population that's reproducing. Those lakes are Alston, Belton, Bridgeport, Brownwood, Buchanan, Canyon, Dean Gilbert, which is a community fishing lake near Sherman. There's a diversion lake south of Medina Lake, which is west of San Antonio, that's infested. Eagle Lake, Georgetown, Granger, Grapevine, Inks, Ladybird, Louisville, Livingston, Lyndon B. Johnson, Marble Falls, Medina, O.H. Ivy, Pflugerville, Placid, Randall, which is a access to Denison County residents only. Ray Roberts, Richland, Chambers, Stillhouse, Hollow, Texoma, Travis, Walter E. Long, and Worth. So those are where there's confirmed infestations in the state of Texas. There's no eradication of it at this point. I mean, I suppose they could use molluscicides, but that's not currently employed. They have detected the larvae or the villagers on more than one occasion in other lakes in Texas. So it is spreading. I found it very interesting that it's been found up in up in Lampasas, which is up in the center of the state. So it's probably right there. Anyway, if it's in a lake within that watershed, more than likely it's going to be infested one day. And then whatever's surrounding that lake or the use of that lake, because we have a lot of power plant lakes here in the state of Texas. They're made just as a cooling lake, a cooling reservoir. That could potentially create problems and interrupt power, especially during a long hot summer like we're having, if they have to shut down some of these power plants to clean them. Management, they do use molluscicides and a whole variety of things. I'm not going to go through that list, but just be aware that there are a lot of tools in our toolbox to control it, but still it costs, they have to shut everything down, and it's not really effective to, depending on the size of the plant, to eradicate them cleanly. The best thing you can do is, you want to clean, drain, and dry your boat, trailer, and all equipment before relocating it to a lake that's not infested. It is in the Brazos River drainage, so I don't know if, that might be something our local master naturalists might want to do, be on the lookout for it, and maybe get the first ID on that in Brazoria County or other counties that may not be. All right, so this is a presentation that was actually, I saw back in 2010. It was the first presentation on the lionfish. I saw it at the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is made up of the 5 natural resource agencies along the Gulf States, and it was given there. I've modified the presentation for this particular one. Lionfish, there's 2 species, Pteris volitans and then Pteris miles. It's from the South Pacific. It came in through the aquarium trade. It's disputed exactly when it was here. Some people say 1992. There is also evidence that it was first identified in Florida in 1985. And since that is listed on that USGS site, I'm going to take that as where it actually came from. The aquarium trade was right before Hurricane Andrew. There was supposed to be an aquarium in Miami, had 6 lionfish in it. Of course, Hurricane Andrew was a Category 5. It wiped out whole buildings. The theory is that the lionfish were then released because of that hurricane and then have since spread. The ecological threat to lionfish is that they prey on our native species. I'm going through this rather quickly. That's just another picture of them. By the way, the lionfish, Pteris valtens, and then Pteris miles are indistinguishable when you're viewing them side by side. Different species, but indistinguishable. And Pteris miles is in the Indian Ocean, and it's not named a lionfish. It's called devil firefish. So here's a map. If you'll watch this map, you'll see the spread. This is from 1997, and then you'll just watch it does end at 2010, but you can see how rapid the spread of the lionfish are in the continental United States, the Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas, Cuba, Gulf of Mexico, all the way down to Venezuela. So it's good that that map stopped at 2010, because 2010 was when we first ID'd lionfish in the state of Texas. And that was in the northern Gulf of Mexico on the flower banks. And since then, it has spread throughout Texas, and it's going to continue to spread. And here's why. Oh, by the way, the places that has been ID'd in Texas are Aransas Bay, West Galveston Bay, South Corpus Christi Bay, Tres Palacios Bay, East Matagorda Bay, West San Antonio Bay, South Padre on the North Jetty. So it was caught there. And then lo and behold, there's one ID at Surfside Beach, I believe along the jetties, where it was caught. And that was in 2022. So that was a fairly new sighting. The first sighting in Texas after it was found at the flower gardens was in Aransas Bay in 2011. So this is the potential range, and it's due to the fact that that lionfish temperature tolerance is 50 to 95 degrees. They can inhabit marine and brackish water, so you will find them in the bay systems. And they have been found inshore, near shore, and then all the way out to 1,000 feet deep. And that, when I came across that, I thought, wow, that's some fish. But that's the potential spread of them. And this was in that 2010 presentation based on the sea surface temperature. But then when we look at the current spread or the current range, here again, they have not spread beyond this portion of South America, but from that previous slide, they have the potential to go all the way. These are the red lionfish, and then these are going to be the devil, the cousin, if you will. I forgot the common name of it, sorry. But you can see that it's these are the range. This is the lionfish range in green. This is the other species, miles range, but it's gone invaded the Red Sea and then spreading throughout the Mediterranean Sea, but they believe it entered through the Suez Canal and is now, moving, or from the Red Sea has spread into the Mediterranean Sea and spreading. So what is the problem with the lionfish? Well, one, the females are very have high fecundity, which females and males, so they mature sexually at a year old or a little before. They spawn, and the peak spawning is in the summertime. They can spawn the females can lay eggs every 3.5 to 4 days. They can produce 25,000 eggs per spawn and upwards of 200,000 eggs per month per female. In these pictures, the eggs are encased in a gelatinous mass that floats at the surface. And one study has shown that the eggs may be toxic to fish that eat them. So gar eggs are toxic to other fish, just as a side fact. And of course, they have a very high fertilization rate. So that's one of the problems of why they're such a successful invader. They cause ecological havoc on natural reefs. In fact, if you're a certified scuba diver, you can join the crew that goes out and spearfishes them on flower garden banks out in the Gulf of Mexico. But they're not limited to natural reefs. This is artificial reef structure that you can see. They're quite prevalent on this artificial reef. This fish in this picture is 300 millimeters. They did a gut content survey, and it contained 21 juvenile tomates in the stomach. So what they're doing, what lionfish are doing, are they're eating the reef fish that our native species rely on. And they found that, and just not commercial species, but recreational species, you know, grouper, snappers, and, you know, you just name all the different species that you can find on coral reefs or around artificial reefs. They have found that on sites that are heavily invaded by lionfish, they can reduce the fish population by 90%. And that's because they have a voracious appetite. Predation. This is one photograph where this grouper has eaten a lionfish. You can see the lionfish in its mouth. However, most native species do not prey upon them. There's another video I saw of a great barracuda eating one that a diver spearfished and gave, you know, hand-fed the barracuda. But by and large, studies are showing that most native species avoid it, and it's primarily because of the venomous spines. And here's some aquatic invasive species outreach, just a poster that was circulated back, making the public aware of this particular aquatic invader. It's an old poster, but I mean, it's still pertinent today. And then apparently human beings need to be the top predator on this particular invader. So here's something that's pushing the eating of lionfish, because they are considered to be very tasty and a delicacy. What's interesting is that there's been a study that says 27% of mature lionfish would have to be removed monthly for 1 year to reduce the population growth to 0. And since they are quite tasty and edible, the Turks and Caicos sponsor year-long or annual year-long fishing tournaments for the most lionfish caught. In this video, there's a diver off the coast of Pensacola, Florida, on an airplane wreck, spearfishing lionfish. Pay attention to the number of lionfish and how quickly the diver harvests them from this wreck site. that video was very telling in showing how many number of lionfish were just on that one reef site. So you can imagine reefs, artificial and natural reefs across the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico, and also wrecks, and just how prevalent that invader is. So as I said earlier, that man's going to have to be the top predator on the lionfish, since native predation doesn't appear to be doing the job. All right, we're going to switch to the one mammal in our aquatic invader species, and that's going to be the nutria, Myocastor corpus, which is a mammal in the Rodenta family. So it is, I mean, in the Rodenta order. So it is a large aquatic rodent. They originate from South America. Man was the vector. In other words, man is the one who is responsible for bringing it into the United States and then spreading it. It can be found in the Gulf Coast states, up the Atlantic coast, Pacific Northwest, California, and one of the significant impacts it has is overgrazing the wetland. So we'll take a little closer look at nutria and a little bit more specific details about them. All right, you can, how would you identify nutria if you were to see one in the wild? Well, first of all, they're going to be around water, so they're a semi-aquatic rodent, and their fur is a dark brown. The adults are approximately 24 inches long, and they have a tail that's 13 to 16 inches long, with a little bit of hair on it. The males are slightly larger than the females, and both male and females can grow to be about 20 pounds. Sorry, about 12 pounds. And then there are some larger specimens that were up to 20 pounds. 20 pounds for males and 18 pounds for females. They have this dense grayish underfur, which is overlaid by long glossy guard hairs. And that varies in color from either dark brown to yellowish brown. Their paws are well developed, and they have clawed toes. And then on the hind legs, 4 of the 5 clawed toes are interconnected by webbing for swimming. Let's see. Their hind legs are larger than their forelegs, which makes sense if they're using their back legs for swimming. And then, like beaver, they have these large incisors, and they can be yellowish orange to orange red on the outer surface. And we'll see a picture of that in the next slide. So there's some adult nutria. And you can see that they just look like large rats. So how'd they get here? Well, they were first introduced in California in 1899 for fur farming. However, that population was not successful, did not reproduce, and was not established. However, in subsequent years, more introductions took place. So by 1940, nutria populations were well established in the wetlands of Louisiana and California. Now, over the years between 1899 and then the other introductions that took place, people were one of the significant factors was that in 1940, the fur trade collapsed, so nutria farmers released them into the wild. Also, there was a hurricane in 1940 which caused destruction to a lot of the caged captivity, the nutria that were in captivity, their cages, and those were released, accidental escape into the wild. And then even some state agencies and private landowners released them intentionally. And here again, primarily because the collapse of the fur trade. But as we go further into the history of nutria, they were sold to individuals in other states as weed cutters to control the undesirable vegetation around wetlands, around ponds, and so forth. And then also the state and federal agencies at the time were known to have translocated nutria into Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Georgia, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi. State and federal agencies are known to have translocated deliberately nutria into Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas with the intent that they would control aquatic vegetation and enhance trapping opportunities because they are a fur bearer. Even today, they're a fur bearer. And there was a push in Louisiana not that many years ago to turn nutria into fur coats for the fur trade. So there's these are the ecological threats. Nutria graze heavily on a variety of native, emergent, floating, submerged, and woody plant species rather. Their grazing has been documented to reduce diversity and richness of plant species within the wetlands. The second point, their herbivory have caused the exclusion of native vegetation, such as broadleaf arrowhead and bald cypress, even to the point to where reforestation was delayed or impacted because the nutria would eat the seedlings as they were planted, and then they would have to be replanted. And so it drove the cost up of reforestation in some of those marshlands in Louisiana and other places. And of course, they would consume any plants that were available to them because they are herbivores. In one study, they showed that nutria, in their gut contents, had roots. So they would dig up the roots and eat the roots, but they also would eat the stems and the leaves and so forth. The third point is that they would compete with the native muskrat and reduce its population, competing directly with muskrats for food source, space, and habitat. And then habitat alteration, it's been shown through studies that they reduced both the above and below ground plant biomass within their habitats. And here again, that goes back to their herbivory of just consuming the plants, roots, and stems and leaves. Also, for a human health concern, nutria do carry some pathogens and parasites that can affect humans. The sixth point, their impact on agriculture and aquaculture. They threaten crop production directly through their destructive grazing habitat. You can think about them being a small feral hog. At least that's how I do, because they go into a field and they eat on the plants, which lowers the yield of the crops. So some of the crops that they have impacted would be alfalfa, rice, wheat, barley, oats, corn, carrots, cauliflower, cucumbers, melons, and beets. In aquaculture, they impact that, and they can impact crawfish farms, because in crawfish production, the farmer would plant rice and then flood the field and have crawfish, introduce crawfish. And then the crawfish, the idea is that the farmer would, the crawfish burrow down after the eggs are fertilized. They go into burrows, and then the rice field is drained and the rice is harvested, and then the field's reflooded and the crawfish emerge from the burrows and then feed on that rice stubble, and then they're harvested in the next spring or early or late winter of the following year. And but the nutria would go in there and decimate the rice crop. They also, which is one of the significant problems, is the damage to infrastructure, in that they do construct extensive burrow systems, and they'll enlarge the existing burrows that are created by native species such as muskrats. But also their burrowing threatens numerous forms of public and private infrastructure. The burrows can weaken the structure of highway bridges, culverts, roadways, building foundations, which of course causes considerable damage through settling and erosion. Levees and irrigation canals used for water control are often damaged from the burrows created by nutria. In fact, when I was working in Louisiana, the sheriff in a neighboring parish to reduce nutria, because they were affecting the drainage canals and flood control canals, he was proposing that his sniper team go out in night using night scopes to snipe the nutria, because they are nocturnal, and that way they could reduce the population that way. That particular plan didn't go over well with the public. It was highly publicized in the local papers, and there's, as you can imagine, there was an outcry from the public on that. But they can be controlled through poisoning or adding a toxin to yams, which they are then attracted to and then they consume. Also, they're trapped, and the hides or the fur is processed for the fur industry. So these trappers sell their pelts to a furrier, and then the meat is then sold then to alligators, alligator farmers, who then use it to feed alligators. There's also a push, sort of like lionfish. There's a contest for chefs to come up with recipes utilizing nutria as the main ingredient, and that wasn't all that long ago. Well, 20-something years ago, I guess. But so there's been some innovative and interesting concepts on trying to control them, but they definitely are a pest. So if we look at this map, this is from 2007, and we can see the distribution on this particular map get a little bit here in Texas, you know, a little bit down in the Rio Grande Valley. Louisiana still has quite a bit of it. We have quite a bit of it up here in Arkansas in this in the drainage. We've got quite a bit over here in Florida. Oregon was one of the original states where the fur industry, they're trying to promote fur industry. And so we see a lot in Oregon, even over here in Idaho and Wyoming. But check out the most current map. And we can see that those ranges or the distribution have expanded significantly. And this is from August 5th of 2023. And this is taken from that United States Geological Survey website, which we'll be sending links out to. But you can see that their range has expanded quite a bit. Quite a bit of Texas is covered. Almost all of Louisiana is covered. Significantly, Washington State and Oregon. I mean, Oregon has a really good amount. But even way up here in Minnesota, you can see there's a population of them right on the border of Canada and the United States up here in Minnesota. So they are a problem. Very adaptable, apparently, even though they come from a semi-tropical environment. But because of their adaptability and their fur, they're able to survive those colder climates and apparently do very well. All right, so this could be our next invasive species on the horizon, the bovine marinus sea cow. Don't know much about it, but you can see that it's out there frolicking with the dolphins. Here are some resources. These are the links that we'll be sending out in an email to y'all. But here again, these are all really good websites to learn more about invasive species. They have a great database you can search by common name or scientific name, and you get back a really good amount of information. And lastly, leave you with a little humor. Here's a cartoon that I had, the Coqui Cabana, and Coqui is a frog, so it's a takeoff on the Copacabana. And with that, I will end the presentation and take a look at the chat and field any questions that you all may have. All right, that's a great question. Do the weevils die after they eat the salvinia? I don't know the answer to that question, Kathy. They do lay eggs, so there is a larval form of the weevil, and then they go through the metamorphosis and they produce an adult. I would have to do a little more research digging into that question, but I will do that and I'll get that answer to y'all. Lionfish are beautiful. They're a very popular aquarium trade, or very popular marine species in the marine aquarium trade. Unfortunately, they do have the venomous spines. If you do introduce them to your home aquarium, I'm sure they cleaned out every other expensive reef fish you had in there. Consequently, that led to aquarists dumping their lionfish into the natural environment to get rid of. Okay, is there any thought to commercial fishing for lionfish? That's another great question. There are, although in my research, there are applications for permits for commercial fish traps for them. So yes, there's a movement to trap them commercially. But then here again, as a recreational diver, I don't even think it's kind of like shooting feral hogs. You have to have a hunting license, but there's no season, there's no limit. So I think they're treating lionfish similarly to feral hogs in that you may have to have a state fishing license, but then you can go and take them by any means necessary. Of course, people are spearfishing them because of the venomous spines. No, so if we saw the spines or those modified fins, those are the spines. So it looks like they're wings or feathers. Those That's a modified pectoral fin or pelvic fin or anal fin. Those are coated with a venom. Now the venom is, you have to be injected by the spine in order to get envenomated, but it's not. It depends on your sensitivity to it. I mean, it can be painful, but someone that's sensitive to it, it could send them to a hospital, to the hospital. Just touching the spines isn't going to cause you illness. You have to have the venom injected under your skin for it to become a problem. All right, I do not see any other questions. That concludes the presentation for the evening. This is our last Water Wednesdays for 2003. I hope all of you will join us for 2004. I haven't set the dates for those, but I will probably start it up in the spring of next year. But I'll work with my committee to get some input on that, figure out what we want to do. All right. Well, thank you so much for showing up tonight. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you learned something, and be looking for that email with the anonymous link to my post test, or retrospective post, I should say. Good night, everyone.